welcome to God is Open. I am your host, Christopher Fisher. Today on God is Open, we're going to be discussing this tangential aside that Marlon Wilson goes through. It's like a little rant in his discussion with Dr. Michael Presidio. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but that's irrelevant. This is all Marlon Wilson, and his claim is that if God counts the number of hairs on someone's head, then that means God micromanages all things from all eternity, controls everything. And so let's hear him work through that logic.
It's like, okay, are you saying that you can undermine the things that God has determined? Are you saying that God, like I asked a friend of mine, this is a real conversation me and my friend had, right? We were talking about divine determinism, more responsibility, problem, evil, the whole nine, right? The whole thing. And so I'm talking to him and I ask him, I say, hey, did God determine the amount of hairs you have on your head? Like, does he know for sure the amount of hairs you have on your head?
Okay, so notice what's going on here. This seems to be a bait and switch with the word determine. And so I could determine things. I could determine to go to the store later, and then I could go to the store. What that means is I have a thought process in which I think through what I'm going to do, what I need, what I need to accomplish, create a plan, and then determine to execute that plan. I could determine if my kids are telling the truth or not, if they tell me something, and then I question them and go through this. So this type of determination is a thought process. It's thinking through something and coming to a conclusion. And so what seems to happen here is Marlon does a bait and switch. Either it's malicious and he knows what he's doing, he's being dishonest, or it's naivety. He just doesn't understand what he's doing. He just doesn't understand that he's using a bait and switch. He's just not mentally attuned to that. So he says to determine the number of hairs on their head means that you know for sure the number of hairs on someone's head. And so maybe, third option, he thinks that the only way God can know the exact numbers of hairs on someone's head is if he meticulously controlled it from all eternity. But the Bible often talks about God's counting. Now, counting is discursive. Counting is a process. You are situated in some place and you look out, you get information, you gather information from outside yourself. You take that information in, you categorize that information, you process that information. In counting, you look for distinguishable traits that make things discrete objects. This is an entire discursive process. You group objects together and to come to conclusions about how many of those objects there are. Counting is very thought intensive. Counting requires discursive thinking, which Calvinism does not allow. Calvinism does not allow God to think. God can't have one thought, then another. God has to have this purely simple, actualized thought from all eternity in which all things are lumped together. There's no thought process. There's no counting. There's no making decisions. There is no coming to determinations. And so when they use this word, Calvinists, they use the word determinism, they're smuggling in a very strange definition, one that's basically akin to fatalism. And so watch the bait and switch. He said determinism means knowing exactly for sure how many hairs are on someone's head. In his world, God just can't count to know that. Like the Bible says, that's what the Bible says. God counts the hairs of your head. God counts the waters. God counts things because God's thinking is discursive in the Bible. It's not Calvinism. Calvinism is mutually exclusive with the Bible. But let's hear Marlon go on.
And he said, yeah, of course. And I said, well, if God knows the amount of hair that's on your head, he's determined that, right? He determined that that's how many hairs you would have on your head, correct? And he said, yeah.
So pulling up the word determine in the dictionary has several definitions. All of these definitions are in conflict with Calvinism. Number 2 is a common one, ascertain or establish exactly by research or calculation. Again, this is discursive thought. If this definition is true, if God determines things using this definition, Calvinism is false. And of course, we see God determining things all the time in the Bible using this definition, going through thought processes, coming through conclusions, using calculation, using research, and making decisions. Yes, God determines things in the Bible. That means Calvinism is false. The third definition, firmly decide, goes along with the second. But what the conflation is happening with our friend Marlon Wilson is he's conflating definition 1 and 2, which his friend doesn't seem smart enough to pick up on. And so his friend apparently goes along and gets tricked with this bait and switch. But number 1 doesn't sound like Calvinism either. He causes something to occur in a particular way or have a particular nature. In Calvinism, God doesn't have agency. God doesn't have potency. Everything is caused by one eternal simple act, which God had no choice other than to do. God doesn't have volition. And so God doesn't seem to be causing things. When we say someone causes something, we think there's a sequence of actions, there's an agent who interjects and interferes or creates conditions to cause something to happen. In Calvinism, fatalism is true, and that doesn't seem to be the normal definition of cause. So this is one of those situations in which Calvinism's using idiosyncratic definitions of their words.
The amount of hairs you have on your head. And he said, yeah, of course. And I said, well, if God knows the amount of hair that's on your head, he's determined that, right? He determined that that's how many hairs you would have on your head, correct? And he said, yeah. And I'm saying, okay, so how can you undermine what God has determined by your choices when God has determined even who you are, like the hair in your head?
Because God counts the hairs on our head. God doesn't micromanage fatalistically the number of hairs on our head. Counting is an action. Counting is discursive. Counting is processing information. If God counts, Calvinism is false. Turning to Luke 12:7, but even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. And what is numbering? This is just ancient language. It's counting. So you scroll over and it says to enumerate or to count a number. So God counts the hairs on our head. Counting's discursive, God counts, therefore Calvinism is false. So Calvinism takes a proof text that shows that Calvinism is false, and they turn it into a proof text for God controlling, micromanaging all things from time eternal to all eternal. This is how Calvinism works. Their proof texts actually disprove the exact things that they're trying to prove with those proof texts. You just have to read them. Read their proof text and Calvinism falls apart.
Everything. Like, come on. Like, how can you undermine his determination? So whenever I hear someone say that they can't be morally responsible unless they have the option to do this or that, it seems as though they're trying to say, well, I can undermine the determination of God. I can undercut whatever God has determined in my life. But even if, especially with death, like God knows the day you're going to die. He determined the day you're going to die, how you're going to die.
So all the time in the Bible, people undermine God's determinations. God determines to destroy Nineveh in 40 days. God saw that the people repented, and God did not do what God said he would do. We got plenty of instances like this in the Bible. Determining is coming to decisions. It's a discursive process of thinking. If God determines things, Calvinism is false. Marlon then goes on to claim that the day of our death is known by God and how we die and things like that. That's just not within the biblical text. And so you'll see this poor proof texting. He's just making allusions to half verses that he thinks he knows, but those verses just don't exist. And when you turn to whatever references he gives, they say the opposite, and they talk against Calvinism. He has a verse in which God counts, and he uses that as a verse of God controlling all things. If God counts, Calvinism is false.
Under what circumstances you're going to die, he determined that before the foundations of the world. And so when someone says that, are they really implying that they could say, oh no, well, God has determined the way I'm going to die. I'm not going to die that way. Are they really saying that? Are they really?
The funny thing is that we have examples of that in the Bible. And God tells Hezekiah he's going to die. He prays and he gets that changed. And so, yes, people can change their projected mode of death within the Bible. They don't do Bible. Calvinists, always when these Calvinists are making these hypothetical complaints that they think prove their point, you could always turn to examples of that, the very thing happening within the Bible. It's like they They just don't know the Bible well enough to actually make valid complaints.
Implying that they might not say it directly, but perhaps in their conversation, they really don't understand that they're really implying it strongly, that they could say, because I have all these options, I can do otherwise. I do not have to die in the way that God has determined me to die.
Right. The Bible has examples just of that, where God tells certain people how they're going to die, and those people avoid those deaths. And so your objection's invalid. It's kind of like this rhetorical question type fallacy where, oh, wouldn't this be so terrible if this thing happened? But we have examples of those things happening, so not valid whatsoever. Anyways, I thought this was a funny rant. I thought it was indicative of normal Calvinist thought process, that normal Calvinists inattention to detail, not understanding their own theology, not understanding the implications of their proof text, not understanding the way words and language is used, and to hijacking language to mean concepts that are very idiosyncratic, very exclusive to Calvinism, that no one uses these words these ways. And so I thought that was interesting. Anyways, questions, comments, put that down below or start a thread on the God is Open Facebook group. Thank you for listening.